was just being announced in the background there. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Justin Richer. I am an independent consultant with Bespoke Engineering. I've been supporting ONC on a number of efforts for the past couple of years here. And I am joined today with my colleague, Sarah Squire.
Hi, I'm Sarah Squire. I'm an identity architect at Engage Identity.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
What do you think the temperature is?
I'm just going to talk over that background noise best as I can. All right, so we're here today to talk about the standards engagement effort under this project in support to ONC. And that's really been around both the development of various standards and standards profiles, but also the development of tools and implementations of those standards. So we're going to talk specifically about the HEART working group. Andy kind of prefaced that a little bit earlier today. We're going to be getting into a little bit more detail, and also looking at some of the more advanced work we've been doing with UMA 2.0, security events, and a handful of other things that we've been directly involved with. We're also going to take a look at the HEART testing suite and MITREid Connect. These are both implementations. These are actual software that you can go use today, and that implements and helps people to implement all of these various standards. And we're going to wrap with a bit of information about the Move Health Data Forward Challenge, which we have been helping to support. Next slide, please. We're going to start here with HEART, which is kind of an awkward acronym for the Health Relationship Trust, because naming things is hard. And this is a working group that was founded a couple of years ago now under the OpenID Foundation. ONC is one of the founding charter members, and in fact, our intrepid leader, Debbie Bucci, is one of the co-chairs of this working group. Now, this working group is one of the first at the OpenID Foundation to focus on a specific industry vertical, namely healthcare. Not surprising, given that ONC was very interested in helping to spin this thing up. But the interesting thing about this is that, unlike a lot of other working groups at the OpenID Foundation, and that you'll usually find in standards organizations like that, the focus here was not to develop and invent new standards, but instead to apply existing standards into this new vertical space. Because as it turns out, when you take a general purpose standard and apply it to a specific industry, there tend to be a lot of sort of weird little gotchas that it would be nice to have a common solution across within that industry to make things work together even better. And the way that we're going to do that, next slide please, is to build a set of profiles. And those profiles come in two flavors. First off, we have 3 mechanical profiles for the underlying security protocols. Those are OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and UMA, or User Managed Access. That's just what that stands for. And those will be our general purpose profiles. We call them mechanical because they're really not about the healthcare industry. But on top of that, we have in the HEART working group itself 2 semantic profiles for how to use FHIR with OAuth 2 and how to use FHIR with UMA. And an interesting thing about this approach, because HEART, like I mentioned, was one of the first vertical-specific working groups in the OpenID Foundation, other groups are already starting to build on that base that we have, this mechanical base. Specifically, the iGov working group, which is all about international governments engaging with citizens and government agencies being able to talk to each other with federated identity systems, they're already building on top of HEART's mechanical profile for OpenID Connect. Now, there's a lot of good information about iGov out there. We are also involved in that, but not through ONC. It's one of those things where a lot of the same people end up in different standards groups. But that is a separate but related effort that we're not going to cover today. Next slide, please. The mechanical specifications themselves, like I said, are really not meant to be healthcare specific, but their capabilities are driven by what is needed in healthcare use cases and scenarios, which are really kind of the driving forces behind the work that's being done in the HEART working group. Now, a lot of what we've done with these is gone through the original specifications and changed a bunch of things that say, oh, you should do this, or you have an option to do A or B, and change those to a normative must, which is to say there's only one way to do things, one specific way to do things with a justification for why things are done that way. Now, OAuth 2, for example, is a very, very flexible protocol, and that flexibility serves it extremely well out on the wider web, because that means it can be used in a wide range of different use cases. The downside of flexibility like that, though, is, of course, that not everything that implements OAuth 2 is going to be able to just plug into each other automatically out of the box. And that's a goal that we wanted in HART. We wanted something that was a HART-compliant client to be able to plug into a HART-compliant authorization server and a HART-protected resource, and they should all be able to work together. And we did this by mandating key features that improved both interoperability but also security. So, for example, in order to get a resource server to be able to talk to any HART-compliant authorization server, we mandated a token format based on the JSON Web Token, or JWT. And we also mandated the availability of token introspection. Now, that is a choice, but the authorization server needs to make both available so that it can still fit a wide variety of different use cases. We also say that you have to make discovery available. Clients need to authenticate asymmetrically instead of shared secrets. These are all about making sure that you can not only plug into a system, but also that the system that you're running is more secure. So getting rid of shared secrets with clients allows you, or it offers attackers less of a surface for being able to pretend to be somebody's medical record client pulling down their information. Next slide, please. On top, before we get to the semantic side, the mechanical profiles themselves, next slide, please. I just forgot what the next slide was. You're fine. The mechanical profiles were originally published as implementers drafts in February 26, and they were updated this last fall with a really big refactor. The reason for that is that implementers draft by no means means finished. By no means does that indicate that these things are finished. It just means that these are stable enough that we want people to try to build them and see what works and what doesn't and what's unclear. And we got a lot of really good feedback from that, and that feedback was incorporated back into the documents. One of the biggest things we got was that, okay, so most people are only going to be building, say, a resource server. Well, I only want to know about the bits that in these profiles that are apropos to my resource server. I want the other components to do what they're supposed to do, but I want to be pointed at the information that's specifically relevant to me. And so there was a lot of rearrangement of existing requirements in order to fulfill that. We also clarified what it means to be compliant with these things. And as it turns out, compliance is a really tricky question. And we'll get into that more later in the presentation. We're also adding some more information on mobile applications. We didn't have a lot of that in the original documents, but that's going through, and we hope to have, we're actually working on, I literally have the XML editor open on my desk in the background here. We are working on the next round of implementers drafts for these profiles, hopefully have those published and available for vote in the OpenID Foundation in the next couple of weeks. That is the current goal. Next slide, please. On top of these mechanical profiles that are sort of general purpose and not industry specific, we have what we are calling the semantic profiles. Now, these are two profiles that are designed for healthcare specific things. Most specifically, how we use the FHIR suite of protocols, the FHIR resource sets, with both OAuth and user-managed access. Now, to do that, it's not just enough to say, take a HART implementation of, HART-compliant implementation of OAuth and use that to protect a bunch of FHIR resources. There's these connections that you need to make between the two sides, such as, what scope do you ask for when you want a specific kind of resource? How do you tell somebody that they are allowed to read something but not write to it? That's where these semantic profiles come in. The OAuth profile has been in draft form for a bit. That will be in the next round of implementers drafts along with the updated mechanical profiles. And the UMA profile is in progress right now and will also be included in the next round of implementers drafts. So we will be seeing 5 documents coming forward from this working group in the next few weeks as going out as implementers drafts. Next slide, please. Now, HART is not the only standard we've been working with. We've actually been working with a lot of different standards. One that I particularly want to highlight is UMA, User Managed Access. The 1.0 version of the protocol was published a while ago now, and ONC's Privacy on Fire effort, as sort of a predecessor to this current project that, that we're working with ONC today, this demo at HIMSS 2015, it was an implementation of UMA for healthcare. But we found that we ran headfirst into a lot of limitations and assumptions of the UMA protocol as we were building out this demo. So what we decided to do was we took a step back and we're like, okay, so we're going to look very closely at all of these limitations that we're running into and figure out how would we change them. And not just write down on paper what we think might need to change. We actually built a prototype system that we called multi-party delegation, MPD, in order to keep it, be able to talk about it separately from the UMA protocol. And we built that last year in 2016. And we took that MPD implementation and all of the lessons learned, we wrote all of those up and submitted all of these formally to the UMA working group, and we're like, so we tried to use UMA, it didn't quite work. Here's our feedback of how we could make this better. And I'm happy to say that there is a new UMA draft specification that is currently in progress. It is being edited and hopefully finalized soon, that incorporates almost all of the changes that MPD suggested. So work that ONC did was directly related to changing a core internet security protocol like UMA. There's a lot of details on what got changed. I won't get into that unless people ask. I'm happy to go back into that. But the biggest thing is that there's a lot more focus on what's called the wide ecosystem, sort of the user-driven means of being able to connect different systems and components together. And this is all very key for what not only ONC cares about, but also what we care about in the HART working group. Next slide, please.
So one of the standards that we work on is called the Security Event Token. That work actually started in the Kantara initiative under the Consent and Information Sharing Working Group. It started as the concept of a consent receipt. So just like when you make a purchase at a store, you get a receipt for it, the idea was that when you give up your data, specifically in our case your healthcare data, that you get some sort of acknowledgement that that data was received by a certain party and that certain terms were agreed to about how that data would be used. So we think this is a very important part of HART. It's not part of the HART specification specifically, but we wanted to make sure that we could plug it in as an extension to include a concept of consent and auditing within a healthcare context. So that spun off into a working group called Security Event Token at the Internet Engineering Task Force. So we had a birds of a feather meeting at IETF 96, and 96 isn't the year, that's just the meeting number. So that actually occurred last year. And then we had a formal working group meeting at IETF 97, which was also last year. The HART use cases have been submitted to the working group, and we will be meeting again in Chicago very shortly. So that work is coming along, and we're looking forward to seeing the interplay with that in HART. Next slide, please. So we've also been engaging widely with the standards community. As Justin said, we've been working with the Kantara initiative on their UMA project. Within the Internet Engineering Task Force, we've been working with the OAuth working group, obviously, since we're building off of their work, as well as token binding. ACE, COSI, Jose. There are a lot of standards that interrelate to and feed from our work in HART. as well as in the OpenID Foundation, obviously OpenID Connect, and more forward-looking working groups like FastFed and other things that we might be able to integrate into HART in the future. So we have both been actively contributing back to those standards in ways in which HART use cases could be enabled by certain formation of the standards, and also just passively paying attention to what's going on in the wider community to make sure that we are being represented and keeping track of what's going on. So in addition to us being part of other working groups, the HART working group is lucky enough to have a wide diversity of people coming from and overlapping with other standards organizations. So in HART meetings, we have people from Argonauts, from FIRE, people from UMA and OAuth. So we have a lot of people and input feeding into us. So that's been great. Next slide, please. One of the exciting parts of HART is that we want to actually have a test tool where a HART compliant authorization server or resource server can come to our test tool and make sure that they are compliant with every part of the specification technically. So a tool like this already existed for OpenID Connect, and rather than reinvent the wheel, we thought it would be wise to leverage that tool to hire the developer who created it to create a similar tool for the HART profile. So right now there are HART test tools for OAuth and OpenID Connect authorization servers and resource servers. Those tools are functional, but they are fragile. They go down quite a bit, and the functionality is a little bit buggy. We're very concerned about the versioning of these. They are dependent on a wide variety of pieces of software that are custom built and that live in a bunch of different places because of the nature of the legacy system that we based it on. So Justin and I are both concerned about versioning and deployability of this code base. Our intention originally was to have tests for the UMA mechanical profile as well as the semantic profiles for both UMA and OAuth. However, those have not been developed yet. If you do want to take a look at what we have so far, you can go to heart.healthauth.org. That's where our tests are living currently. Next slide. So the code that we're using now requires the newest version of Python. And what that means is that it's an immature language, and so there are few libraries available as packages for developers to integrate into that language, which means that we have a lot of custom-built software. Some of that custom-built software lives in the HART repository, some of it lives in the OpenID Connect repository. It is all open source, it is all on GitHub, but it's spread out in a few different places. It also has dependencies on literally hundreds of other tools and modules. So because of the nature of that legacy system, because of the distributed nature of the code base, Justin and I both have concerns about the scalability and the long-term maintenance and viability of this code base. So I will let Justin tell you about our proposed solution. Next slide.
Thanks. As Sarah mentioned, we intended to try to not reinvent the wheel, but we also thought that we were starting out with a rounder wheel than what ended up being available. So as part of this this effort with ONC last year, we did a very small experiment and basically set aside and brainstormed what it would be like to have a test suite that incorporated all of the lessons learned of what the legacy system did for the OpenID Connect suite of testing. And let me be clear on this: the test suite as deployed for OpenID Connect testing is fantastic. It's functioning very well in that use case. But it was the adaptation and the flexibility to other use cases is where we really ran into some major issues. So we decided to, basically what would a version 2 of this look like? So not based on the legacy code, not even based on the same platform, what would we try to do? And so we took a very small amount of paid time and a fair amount of volunteer time because we thought that this was really important to try this out. And built an experimental system, and we spoke to a few different groups, including Andy's group over at MITREid. As he mentioned, they have a test harness for some components as well, so we brainstormed how these things might work together. And we actually built a proposed alternative system in kind of a sandbox environment to just see what this would look like if it were kind of redeveloped a little bit more cleanly. And that pretty much got to the proof of concept stage because, like I mentioned, we really didn't put a lot of time and funding into this. There were other higher priority efforts throughout the year, but we do think that this is a really important venue for future work. We believe that a solid and flexible test suite for these types of protocols, these multi-party complicated network-based browser and backend and so forth style protocols like OpenID, OAuth, UMA, FHIR, all of these things, we really think that there's a really big opportunity there, that a good investment into a new tool for this would be a huge, huge payback for the community at large. And so that's something that we're seeing as really key future work that we hope comes out of this effort. Next slide, please. So on to an open source project that started out at the MITRE Corporation before I personally escaped. Andy and I used to be colleagues there, and then I ran away. But in any case, this project is a reference implementation that started at MITRE, is now owned by the MIT Internet Trust Consortium, completely open source, entirely Apache 2 licensed, and it implements OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, and UMA. And there are a lot of people that have implemented this and deployed this in a lot of different organizations and groups all over the place. Including, as we'll see, some of the members of the Move Help Data Forward Challenge. Because this is a system where we tried out a lot of the mechanical components that were required in the HART profiles. And we think that it's for us at least, it's been a really, really good implementation platform for trying out experimental things like this MPD/UMA 2.0. We did an experiment with what at the time was called ID events. It's now called security events that Sarah was talking about previously, and also a lot of parts of the HART protocol itself. Now these experiments are published on branches because the core project itself is very stable. It's stable and vetted. It's a very well trusted open source project. A lot of people are using this. But it's also served very well as an experimentation platform, and as an open source project, we can do our experiments out in the open, so you can see what difference would it take from an UMA 1.0 implementation to go to an UMA 2.0 implementation by just comparing these two branches. We think that there's a lot of value in that. Next slide, please. One of the things that we developed last year was under this project on MITREid Connect was something called HART mode. Now, MITREid Connect already supported all of the stuff that you needed to do in order to be a HART compliant authorization server, but it was also general purpose, which meant that you could have non-HART clients talk to this server and it would work just fine. Along the lines of what Andy had mentioned previously as kind of a plain vanilla or an unprofiled OpenID or OAuth 2 connection. And HART allows this. This was one of the things that we clarified in the newer versions of the mechanical specifications from the HART working group, is that you're very much allowed to do this. You're allowed to have a non-HART client talk to your HART compliant server using non-HART protocols. You're allowed to implement these kinds of things in parallel. That pairing is no longer HART compliant, but that doesn't mean that the component that supports both is not itself HART compliant. This is where the tricky nature of compliance really kind of comes into play. So what we decided to do, though, with HART mode was make a special mode that was released in version 1.2.6 of MITREid Connect that turned off all non-HART functionality. So it was, as if you could call this, a strict compliance with the HART protocol, because it did just HART and none of the sort of additional stuff for vanilla OAuth or vanilla OpenID Connect that you might be able to do with a regular off-the-shelf client. So, for example, it enforces strict URI matching, which comes from HART, whereas in plain OAuth, you're allowed to, there are a few different ways that you can do that. I mentioned before that the HART profiles get rid of asymmetric, or they get rid of symmetric shared secrets with clients. With HART mode enabled in MITREid Connect, you can't even get one issued to your client. You're not allowed to use it. All of that is very strictly turned off. And all sorts of other technical requirements get turned on. The other thing so this allowed us to do two things. One was it gives us a way that we can tell people, yes, turn on this server, and much like the test tool, if you can get your client and your protected resource to talk to this authorization server in HART mode, you're HART compliant, because this is only speaking HART. It won't let you speak anything else. The other thing that it allowed us to do was see the places in an existing implementation that needed to change in order to make HART compliance really kind of be a thing. Next slide, please. We have done a fair amount of work to continue development of the MITREid Connect project. Next slide, please, Kate. And we're moving towards version 1.3 of MITREid Connect. And there's a whole lot of features that are going in. Kate, next slide, please. Am I still connected? There we go.
Sorry, I was on pause.
No worries. Thank you very much. So there's a whole lot of stuff that is going into the next version of MITREid Connect. This started in 1.3, and a lot of the stuff that's going in that this team has developed is in direct relation to work that ONC has wanted as part of the supporting the HART project. And so it's adding Pixie support for mobile applications, software statement processing, and also an assertions framework. We've also been able to trim some stuff from older versions. So if any of you remember back in the days of Blue Button Plus, long before HART and you know, sort of back in almost in the Rex days, there was this project called Blue Button Plus, and it had this kind of strange structured parameterized scope. Even back then, we were using MITREid as a platform to try out what that would look like. But we finally pulled that out. And the last thing I want to point out here is that a lot of the new features, including Oracle database support and the upgrades to the new version of Spring Security and whatnot, those have actually come from the open source community. This project has a small but fairly vibrant community. People are really using this server, and they're not only finding bugs, but they're adding new features to it. So the server, for a while now, has had HyperSQL, MySQL, and Postgres support. And somebody came along and said, well, I want to deploy this on Oracle, and so they gave us a pull request, a patch that now enables Oracle database support, if that's what you want to deploy on. And it's really a good indicator of the health of an open source project to see those types of contributions coming in from new developers and organizations that are using this out in the wild. And so we think that we'll see a version 1.3 release hopefully sometime before summer of this year, but we'll see where that happens. Next slide, please. And I mentioned before that multi-party delegation experiment that we had that was out on a branch, that's kind of now turned into an UMA 2.0 experimental implementation. So that is still happening on a branch because the UMA 2 standard is not stable enough to really go into a shipping version of a large project like this, at least in our opinion. But we are going to continue to track it. So this is not just experimental, it's also a real legitimate implementation of this standard going forward. Next slide, and I'll hand it back to Sarah.
So the last thing we'd like to talk to you about is the Moving Health Data Forward Challenge. Justin and I were advisors and judges for the entries to this challenge. It happened in is happening in 3 phases. So the idea is to take potentially for-profit companies from idea to pilot to implementation. So phase 1 was kind of the idea phase that was based on capabilities, potential, and executability. From that phase, 11 winners were chosen, and they got some amount of money. I forget exactly how much. They moved on to phase 2. We just got those entries a couple of weeks ago. That we judged those based on technical merit, viability, and impact. And our judging for that was turned in last week, so the phase 2 winners should be announced any day now. And then at the end of phase 3, we'll eventually come out with 2 winners who will be awarded a total of $75,000 each. So working with those participants has been really great for us. Many of them have joined the HEART working group. Some of them have, as Justin said, leveraged MITREid Connect. And there are a wide variety of ideas. So for example, one is a mobile phone application that takes your normal clipboard data and lets you scan a QR code and send it directly to your doctor on a limited basis of what exactly the patient wants to share and what they don't, what they want to keep to themselves. So that was very exciting to see. And then there's one that's completely different, that's about end-of-life planning and allowing you to create directives and powers of attorney and make sure that you have an API available for the healthcare providers that might be working with you or your family to get that information to them directly. So that's been a really great experience for us, and we're really excited to see what the challenge participants come forward with in the future. Next slide.
And with that, we'll go to questions. Thank you guys very much. We're both here and available for questions and comments.
Well, if there are no questions, I do want to say, this is Gail, and I do want to say thank you, Justin and Sarah. That was very comprehensive and really a lot of the information that I had been asking myself and wanting to know. Anyone out there off of mute and now want to ask questions?
This is Bob Dieter. Let me ask one question. You've made tremendous progress with the HEART profile and trying to lock down the optionality of OAuth, but there's still a fair amount of optionality left. Is the intent to, over time, reduce that even more, or is your goal to keep it open, like lifetime of tokens and I forgot the other one, the re-requests, and there's some things out there that are fairly open-ended yet.
Thanks, that's a great question. So in cases where we have explicitly left things open, like the time to live for tokens, we've also tried to provide guidance for kind of what a default set is. So that a developer coming up without a good reason to pick something else is going to look at this and say like, oh, I guess I'll make that one live an hour. Okay, sure, why not? But people would still be free to say like, okay, no, our API and our deployment environment for this, it doesn't make sense to have tokens flying around for an hour. You know, we've got an API that people are going to, you know, ping once and then the token gets thrown away. I don't want that security credential to live around for that long. That's too much for me. That's too much risk for me. So instead of people being non-compliant with stuff like that in a way that really doesn't ultimately change the interoperability of things, we would rather have guidance for things that make sense for the default case and allow things to be you know, interpreted and used where necessary. That said, I will say that the other major piece of optionality in the HEART profiles is also contextual. So we very explicitly say, if you are doing this type of client application, then follow this recipe. So yes, there is an option of what kind of client you're doing, but once you know what kind you're doing, then what you do is pretty fixed.
So how about things like not requiring refresh tokens to be signed with JAWS versus the original access tokens? I mean, is that an optionality you see continuing?
So the reason that JOTs are, that the access token is required to be signed is so that it can be interpreted by a third party, namely resource servers that are being connected into the system. A refresh token, on the other hand, is intended to be interpreted by the authorization server and issued by the authorization server. So in other words, that's a conversation that it's having with itself, and we don't need to specify the format and content of that in order to promote interoperability at all. So we could say, yes, refresh tokens need to be JOTs, but what would that buy us?
So aren't there time? Okay, that's fine. We'll take that conversation offline.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Incidentally, that is the perfect kind of conversation that I would encourage to happen on the HART working group mailing list. So I would encourage you to take the conversation there, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, go ahead.
Okay, if there's no further questions, we can go ahead and move on.